Carol. I think this feels a little bit like giving a lecture at the Guggenheim. I give a lot of talks, but I've never done with this one. I guess I'd like to say a couple of caveats right off. I was thinking about it. As Carol said, this is not actually, although I teach a lot, this is not a book by a historian. It's a book by somebody who designs tall buildings and has done that for a long time and has thoughts about them. So that's what it's about. Won't defend it in any other context. The other one is, and it's a little dicey, I realized in going back to the book, there's a lot of New York in the book for the obvious reasons. It's tall buildings, right? And one has to be, I think, a little careful talking to New Yorkers about, their own place. My wife assured me that no, they'll love that. They'll love to hear about buildings. So I don't know how it'll work out, but you can't talk about tall buildings and not talk about New York City, obviously. So what I'll do is I'm going to speak briefly, maybe 30 minutes or so, and I'm really just going to go sort of topically through it very broadly, and maybe the first set of images will get us going. Although it's tall buildings and it's a tall book, as Carol noted, imagining...
Sorry, if you stand on that side, we'll be able to see the light on your face, especially...
I don't know, they want to see that.
Not too far. Is that... can you get... Is he in there?
Okay. I'm from Hollywood, and that's in New York.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so the subtitle of the book, Imagine the Skyscraper, is in some ways the key to my angle on this, which is what are those things, broadly speaking, that cause us to think about the skyscraper? Yes, many have been built, many people here, I can tell, I know a number of you have helped build these tall buildings, but it's about the imagination that goes into it and the ideas. Obviously, Peter Bruegel, 16th century, Tower of Babel, someone was thinking about tall buildings even then, and probably 1,500 years before then, and before that, and Vladimir Tatlin's 1919 monument to the Third International. Very different visions of a tall building, and an idea really more than a real thing, a myth, if you will. Next. Really the only chapter that's purely historic, because the book wants to be about the here and now of tall buildings, is the first chapter. It's about the inevitability of the tall building. And I'm going to skim through this very quickly, because many of you know this, but there is, just to anchor this, an idea of what the American cities particularly were prior to tall buildings, and this happens to be Chicago, as many of you will recognize, before the famous 1871 fire, which remade everything. But this is what it looked like, as Carol has outlined better than anyone.
That's my slide over there.
Yes, I'm credited. The next slide, please. Very interesting and very important about the formal nature of the buildings is the blocks were very large in Chicago, over 300 feet and bisected, and so they ended up with very broad floor plates so broadly that they really needed, the way to use them efficiently was to open up the center and huge courts, air courts, light courts through the middle. So you had a series of building typologies that were like that. In, I think it was 1893, there was a little capital crunch, a little overbuilding in the commercial office market. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anybody, but it happened then too. And then a strict limit of 130 feet was put on height limits in Chicago. In New York, on the other hand, and I'm really condensing history here, but from South Street, buildings were taller. They were 500 to 600 plus feet tall. Again, in Carol's book, she talks quite artfully about the nature of Lower Manhattan, the street pattern, the size of those parcels, and the implication, of course, that to get parcels and put them together was difficult. Their relative cost was high as people began commercializing Lower Manhattan. And so the need to build higher FAR, higher density, was higher. So the height was sort of expressive of those different mechanics in New York. So very early on in the tall building in New York was very different from the tall building in Chicago, notwithstanding Chicago's huge contributions. Next. In Europe, it was a very different world, as we know, and most people in this room know a lot about this, but there weren't tall buildings per se. There were 7 to 10 story would be a tall building in Europe in the turning of the 20th century. But in the minds of theorists, particularly Le Courvoisier, as we know, from really 1922 through the 20s, he did a series of plans to remake Paris, or to build a city of 3 million, or to do the Green City. There were a number of names on them, and they were variously an evolving same plan of re-densifying, rebuilding, sort of pure. They began as cruciform towers. He had his 5 principles of architecture, and one of those was in addition to a structural expression, was that they were to be extrusions and that they were to have curtain walls, something that had been really pioneered in America. Reliably, this was very abstract and very geometric, and buildings of 220 meters tall, over 400 meters laterally, which in theory was to be the distance between metro stations. And it was all very hyper-rational. And I think many of us are probably glad that it didn't happen. But it was interesting to me that it was a complete sort of theoretical idea about the tall building when in America it was growing out of really the reality of commerce. Next. And others that we know, of course, Mies van der Rohe and a 1921, I believe, competition for Friedrichstraße, main commercial street in Berlin, a building which is really nothing more than an image, a triangulated building with a round core in the center. A lot that wasn't said about it, but it reflected, as did the next slide, Mies's unwavering interest in the aesthetics of the object, above and beyond all things. This is sort of wavy building, which I'm amused by because the model image is such a transparent thing, things that we've continued to try for over the last decades in more modern times. And in his charcoal drawing is actually a black, opaque, impenetrable thing. Same building, two different sort of aesthetic versions of the same idea. Obviously a designer who's interested in the art, the fine art aspects of the building. Next. Many things happened, and I say I'm going through this very quickly, but sort of realities of America and all the elements that were making tall buildings develop in America, and then sort of the idealism of Europe sort of came to point after World War II in the late 40s with the UN, and I guess it was that Courvoisier was retained in some way to begin early concepts and develop drawings and concepts. Somehow that evolved away from him into a group that was headed by a young Wallace Harrison, which developed and completed the building. I imagine that was problematic, but in any event, we had a building on the river that was a pure prism with isolated geometric objects in kind of a universal ground plane. And that was a new thing in New York and frankly in America at that time. Next. And the buildings that we know, I think maybe love, Lever Brothers, Gordon Bunshaft in 52 and 58, Seagram's building by Mies van der Rohe, supported by Philip Johnson. Two buildings across from each other on Park Avenue, which sort of took this into the commercial realm from the institutional realm, and was apparently popular enough in its time, both, at least professionally, I don't know how the public responded to it, but professionally and within the bureaucracy of planning, that it led to a rewriting of the zoning codes in New York from about 1960, consummated in 1962, which basically said that if you would, said of many things, but chiefly among them, was that if you would give up as much as 40% of the site to open space, which basically supported the idea of an extrusion, that you could get a density credit of as much as 20% density. So basically the bureaucracy was supporting an attitude, we could talk about in detail what it meant, but it certainly was in the wake of these early informative buildings. Next. And led to many things. 6th Avenue, one of them, and a whole generation of buildings throughout all American cities, really, not quite as descriptive or legible as it is in this example. And then coming back to sort of seeing how we've gone sort of full circle with the idealism of European rationalism, revisited on America and now evolving decades later in America. Next. The second chapter is called Enrichment of Vertical Space, which is complex words for anyone who works in this area, mixed-use buildings, mixed-use vertical. And if you travel, many of you do in Europe and other cities, it's not a new phenomenon, but it's reasonably new in the United States. The tall buildings really evolved for a lot of reasons out of sort of extrusions of common space, an office building that was virtually 100% office, or a freestanding hotel. So the development of the mixed-use vertical building, which is now in huge development for a lot of reasons, took a while after World War II to sort of get purchased. Next. And again, considering the title and the imagination of the skyscraper, some of the original notions of this really came out of really just that, just notions and ideas and images as much as real opportunity to build them. Moses King, travelogue master of the early 20th century, images and postcards of New York City as it would be in the future back then at the turn of the century, and one can see all